Chapter 7 Mexico. The letters with which Don Mariano de Urquizo had furnished Humboldt before leaving Spain introduced him at Acapulco and throughout Mexico, as they had already done in South America, to the highest government officials. We accordingly find him 3 days after his arrival at the house of the Contador Don Balazar Alvarez Ordono, taking observations to ascertain the latitude and longitude of the town. Except in a scientific point of view, Acapulco had little to attract him. It stood on the southern shore of Mexico, on the recess of a bay, near a chain of granitic mountains. On a hill commanding the town and the entrance to the harbor stood the castle or fortress of San Diego. The harbor was shut in by mountains. It had 2 entrances formed by the island of Roqueta, one a quarter mile of wide and the other a mile and a half. This was the extent of its picturesqueness. From Acapulco, in the beginning of April, the travelers produced to the capital, passing the plains of Chilpancingo, rich in wheat fields, and the little town of Tasco, famous for its beautiful church. They stopped at Cuernavaca, on the southern declivity of the Cordillera of Coatlicue, to rectify the longitude which was incurrent on the common maps. Not far from Cuernavaca was the monument of Xochitloco, an isolated pile 350 feet high. It was a mass of rocks to which the hands of man had given a regular conic form. It was divided into 5 stories, or terraces, each of which was at least 60 feet high, but narrowed towards the top. The hill was surrounded with a deep and broad ditch. The whole encampment was nearly 12,000 feet in circumference. The summit, which was an oblong platform, 230 feet from north to south and 300 feet from east to west, was encircled by a wall of hewn stone, 6 or 8 feet high. Within this wall stood the remains of a pyramidal monument. It was originally 5 stories high, but only the first story remained, for the owners of a neighboring sugar house had demolished the rest and used the stones to build their ovens. There was no vestige of a staircase leading to the top of the pyramid, where it was said there was once a stone seat ornamented with hieroglyphics. The stones of the pyramid were beautifully cut and polished, and decorated with reliefs. As each of these reliefs occupied several stones, and as they were interrupted by the joints, they must have been sculpted after the edifice was finished. Among the hieroglyphic ornaments were heads of crocodiles spouting water, and figures of men sitting cross-legged, after the manner of some Asiatic nations. As the building was on a plain of 4,000 feet above the sea, and crocodiles haunted only the rivers near the coast, it was then strange that the architect should have sculpted them, instead of the plants and animals that belong to the mountainous countries. This artificial mountain or pyramid was probably a fortified temple, which was originally contained in an arsenal and served in war as a fort. The Indians of the neighborhood showed an ancient map drawn before the arrival of the Spaniards, in which, where this monument should have been, there was a rude sketch of 2 warriors fighting with clubs. And about 30 years before the arrival of Humboldt and Bonpland, an isolated stone was found nearby with a relief of an eagle tearing a captive. It was in the capital, however, which they reached, that the travelers found the greatest number of ruins. In fact, the city of Mexico was based on the ruins, the wrecks of ancient capital Tenochtitlan. Under the great square were fragments of the spacious temple of Mexitili. Behind the cathedral was the palace of the king of Axayacatl, where Montezuma lodged the Spaniards on their arrival, and opposite of the viceroy's palace stood formerly the palace of Montezuma himself. These things had a great influence over the imaginative travelers, but their first object after finding residence and delivering the letters was to inquire for a new set of scientific instruments. In order to pursue their studies, they were not content to run through the country like ordinary travelers, chronicling their journeys by a list of the inns which they had stopped, nor yet like artists or poets alive to the charm of beautiful artistry, scenery, and strange traditions. They were poets, artists, travelers, it is true, but they were something more. They were men of science, philosophers, savants, whose business and pleasure it was to understand what they saw. They would read, or at least try to, every page in the great world book, not skipping any, because they were not common or tedious, but reading all. They found in Mexico a school of minds, like the Mineralogical Academy of Freiburg. The director, by the way, was a pupil of Humboldt's old teacher, Werner. A botanic garden and an academy of painting and sculpture. The last bore the title of Academia de los Nobles Artes de Mexico. It owed its existence to the patriotism of several private citizens and the protection of the minister, Galvez. The government had assigned it a spacious building, which was enriched by a finer and more complete collection of casts than what was at that time to be found in any part of Germany. Humboldt was surprised and delighted when he saw the Apollo, the Belvedere, and the Lagoon. There were no fees for entrance at the academy. It was free to all, even mulattoes and Indians. The rooms were lighted with every evening with argand lamps and filled with hundreds of young people who drew from reliefs or living models or drawings of furniture, chandeliers, or ornaments. In bronze, the director of the class of sculpture, Don Manuel Toleza, had just completed a bronze equestrian statue of Charles V, the then reigning king of Spain. Humboldt was present when it was cast, and saw it move to the great square, a 5 days' task, and the buildings around the square were not lofty. It looked admirably on its pedestal, standing gradually out from its blue background of the sky. This royal statue, the Viceroy's palace, and above all, the new cathedral with its massive towers, made the great square an imposing place. Humboldt did it full justice. He had no doubt, for his tastes like his powers were universal, but we suspect it interested him more than what it had been, than what it was. More for what it was under it than what was above and around it. Below it, as we have already remarked, were the remains of the great temple of Mexitli, the fragments of which were frequently brought to light. A few years before their arrival in August 1790, some workmen who were employed there in making excavations in order to build a subterraneous aqueduct discovered a great Aztec idol of basaltic porphyry. It was about 20 feet high and 6 or 7 feet broad, and almost sculpted on every side. At first it appeared an almost shapeless mass, but on being examined closely, upon the upper part was found the united heads of two monsters. The eyes were large, and in each mouth were 4 hideous teeth. The arms and feet were hidden under a drapery surrounded by enormous serpents. The ancient Mexicans called this drapery the garment of serpents. All these accessories, especially the fringes, which were in the form of feathers, were sculpted with the greatest care. This double idol probably represented Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of war, and his wife, Teoyamiki, who conducted the souls of the warriors who died in defense of the gods to the house of the sun, where she transformed them into hummingbirds. Her bosom was surrounded with death heads and mutilated hands, symbols of the sacrifices which were collected in honor of this horrible pair. The hands alternated with the figures of vases in which incense was burnt. As the idol was sculpted on every side, it was doubtless surrounded in the air on 2 columns, between which the priests dragged their victims to the altar of the temple beyond. Upon the underside was the idol was a representation of Michilantecutli, the lord of the place of the dead. It was a fitting roof to that terrible portal of death. The viceroy, Count Revillagigedo, transported it to the university in Mexico, but the professors of the university were unwilling to expose it to the sight of the Mexican youth, so they buried it anew in one of the passages of the college. As Humboldt's solicitation, the Bishop of Monterrey, who was passing through the capital on his way to his dionysus, persuaded the rector to unbury it, which gave the traveler an opportunity of sketching it. Humboldt was shown another idol at the house of the Senor Dupe, one of his Mexican friends. It represented a sitting, or rather squatting woman. She had no hands, but where they should have been, there were toes of her feet. This statue was remarkable for its headdress, which resembled the veils sculpted on the heads of Isis and the Sphinxes. The forehead was ornamented with a string of pearls on each side of a narrow fillet. The neck was covered with a 3-cornered handkerchief, to which hung 22 little balls or tassels. These tassels and the headdress generally reminded Humboldt of the apples and pomegranates on the robes of the Jewish high priests. This strange figure was called the statue of the Aztec priestess, but Humboldt thought it was a representation of some of the old Mexican divinities. It was probably one of the old household gods. Beside the statue, he saw the great monument of the calendar and the statue of sacrifice, adorned in relief with the triumphs of some old Aztec king, both of which were dug up in the great square. He also visited the archives of the viceroyalty and pored over its hoard of Aztec manuscripts. These hieroglyphs were written either on agave paper or on stag skins. They were frequently from 65 to 70 feet in length, and each page contained from 2 to 3 feet of surface. They are folded here and there in the form of a tomb, and thin wooden boards fastened to the extremities formed their binding and gave them a resemblance to our volumes in quarto. No nation of the old continent ever made such an extensive use of hieroglyphic writings as the Aztecs. And in none of them were real books bound in this way. Humboldt procured several fragments of similar manuscripts during his stay in Mexico.